Good morning. Ayin Beis. We concluded the paragraph on the top of page 1247. But as discussed, we're going to go over it a little more in detail, break it down, and try to understand the full scope of what the Rabbi Rashab is saying. So, briefly, first, just where are we? He's explaining two levels. In the highest level itself, in V'ahavtas Hashem L'kecha itself, there are levels. V'chol levavcha, v'chol nafshecha, which we spoke about, are both love that are still contained within the structure of the person. V'chol levavcha is in the heart. V'chol nafshecha extends to all his faculties, meaning his whole being is involved in that love. And he gave the example, for example, when a person runs to do a mitzvah. So it's not just that they feel love in their heart, they actually, their whole being is involved. Now, always a good example for this is the love between human beings. You can love someone, and you may not go ahead and just do every chore or everything that you need to do that expresses that love. So b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha is basically both, he said, a love that comes up his seichel, and das, tam v'das, and that's why it's within the construct of the human being. The example he gave was the river that fills all the way till its banks, chog desov, meaning all its till the banks of the river, but does not overflow. Then comes b'chol ma'idecha, which, as the word implies, is already what he calls bli gvul. And here he associates it now with a natural love. It's not just a love that comes that makes sense. And based on Seichel, on page 1245, he made it clear that B'chol Ma'idecha is now going, let's just look at the exact language because I want to refer to it. Ava Atzmi Shebenefesh She'en Zeh Mitzad Chiyuv HaSeichel is the core love in the nefesh, the person's soul, that's not due to a reason. It's just the way we are. That the neshama has a natural connection with his God. That the nefesh itself desires it. So, on one hand, it doesn't permeate intelligence quite until we get to the higher level, which we'll talk about in a minute. But on the other hand, it's a natural, and therefore it is one that is beyond just a structural. And here he says there are two levels. One that is purely based on that natural connection. And that's why it's excitable, it's stimulated, and it's primarily in the heart. The mind is not involved except in just making you aware that you are in the presence of your father, or in this case, the neshama is in the presence of godliness. So it's just a matter of awareness, not that the mind is involved in the process of the very love itself. And so even though it's in Pnimius HaNefesh, he called it the chitzenius of the atzmis. First level, b'chol meidech. The second level, I'm reading from the bottom of page 1245, which is the level where now he says, Emek nekudus HaNefesh, ava atzmis mamish. And here, the mind is getting involved, but not like in the b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, where the mind is only involved as far as creating an emotion. Here, the emotion doesn't have to be created, it's natural. But now you're applying, you're moichin the godless, all the hamokas hadas, as he said, the full immersion in something that's negei benefesh, because this is a love that's a natural one, the soul's inherent love to godliness, and you're involved in it in the full appreciation of it, not like just a natural love that a child would have to its father. But here it's a mature process that is also, as I said, hamokas hadas, that you are like an intimate connection with it. And when you have that, it creates two things. Number one, it's far deeper and completely creates bittul within the person instead of expansion. And secondly, it's not expressible. It doesn't have a sound. It's quiet. Not because it's quiet, because it's so profound that it defies and transcends sound and expression. That just sums up what he said. And Navedas Hashem, he spoke about Chana, Tefillah, prayer on this level, when it's coming from that form of depth. So here, in an interesting way, you have Seichel and Midas working together, but not a Seichel that's giving birth to Midas, Like when we spoke about Bina, as it's a mother that gives birth to its offspring, and Revetzes al Efreichim, it hovers and protects and guides them and trains them and tames them, etc. But here, the Midas have now elevated the Meichin all the way to something that's super rational, to the very core love. But now you have also the intelligence involved, but not intelligence as we'll call it a comprehension, because it's not about comprehension. He said clearly this is higher than comprehension. It's supra rational. It's super conscious, but it's a full immersion, a full mature, intimate immersion into the experience of this love. And this is this higher level that he's talking about. And here he says clearly, okay, it's quiet, it's silent. I want to see if I summed up everything. And the same thing with Avos Hashem. Yeah. Because I was thinking, the Avos Hashem, you could say, so why doesn't he say that you contemplate with Hamokas Hadas, with that deep, personal, intimate immersion, that you're concentrating on how God is your Father? In other words, how you are chelik elokam mal mamish, and that should affect the person in that way. But he doesn't say that. Same thing in Tanya. He says that these bonanus, the maimik meich machshavte, how everything is kuli kamei kaloch oshuv, and everything is completely nullified before him, and as such, ayidei a case of v'shukas nafshe. He wants to have the case of v'shukas nafshe lalish lichol ba'atzmo sein sof. This is vital points that I'm going to now elaborate on. It's interesting because you could have said, like he said earlier in the Hemshech, a bunch of pages back, that you contemplate how God is your Father and how you're one with Him and so on. It would be like in any type of situation where a child is contemplating on the Father's connection. And that would seem to so-called develop the love even deeper than just the natural love without concentration on it, just awareness of it. But I believe this is the main reason, and this is where I want to now elaborate on, and this is coming all from Tanya, and essentially implicit in the words of the Rebbe Rashab. So bottom line, just to sum up again, in the Etzem HaNefesh itself, there's the Chetzenius HaAtzmis, which causes a thirst. Keep that in mind, the thirst. And the Pnimius of the Atzmius, which causes a Kiloyim, meaning completely being dissolved and absorbed in the source. Thirst is still a step. You're thirsty for it, but you're not consumed by it. Completely consumed through like returning, so to speak, back into the source. Okay. Now, one more. I'm going to elaborate now on this whole point and I'll be able to understand the parentheses well that we learned. Actually, it's two parentheses. One that is, this is all in Ratzon. Chetzenius and Primus Aratzim, which I will explain shortly, the Metzach, forehead. And secondly, what we learned from chapter 50 in Tanya. But before explaining it inside here, let me just go back. Let's step back a moment and talk about these different levels of love and what we're talking about here. So, I mentioned yesterday the chapters in Tanya that are very relevant to all of this discussion is chapter 3, chapter 9. I didn't mention 9, but I'm mentioning it now. Chapter 16, chapter 39 to some extent, but 43 and 44, and chapter 50. They all are part of the story of love, different levels of love that are both, as we'll talk about in a moment, the different forms of love. I'll go through, I'll try to do it very organized, step by step, to make this easier to understand. So, the first thing let's establish, and before I say that, let me just look at one thing. I want to see it inside Tanya here, 1 second. Okay. The first thing, and this is also going to be helpful in understanding the whole flow in Ayin Beis. There's natural love, and there's a love that is created and born through contemplation. Natural love is, let's say, we're talking on a human level, anything that's biologically, genetically wired within us. The natural love you have to family, to parents, to siblings. Here we're talking, of course, to father, to parent. Seicheldika love is one that is not about you were born with it. Through your life experiences, especially as you become an adult, you contemplate on something, you become aware of something, and that awareness teaches you how to appreciate something else until the point that you get attracted to it. So it's a love that is al-pi seichel. That's one distinction. In the natural love itself, there are also stages, as we've learned. The stage where it's purely natural, look, a newborn baby, or even a young baby, let's say a young baby, is drawn to its mother and father, especially mother. It doesn't come with any seichel. It's completely reflexive, but part of that wiring. That same baby, when it will be, let's say, 30 years old, or 20 years old, or 15, whatever age, will still have that natural love, but it will be far more mature. You know, I'll just example, since the Rebbe's mother's yahrzeit was this week. You see the Rebbe's relationship with his mother. You can imagine it was very different when he was 2 years old. And then when we saw the Rebbe visited his mother every day, and the Mesiras Nefesh and how much he invested, and the pain he had for not being able to honor his father and mother for so many years. So clearly, I'm talking even on a human level, not just as a Rebbe. It's far more mature type of love. It's still the natural, but the natural is informed by a process. And very much what we've learned through this Ayin Beis, when we spoke about mudva, murgish, muskel, that's what we were talking about. The mudva is the natural. The murgish is the natural starting to become tangible, a palpable feeling. Then there's the muskel within the murgish al pi seichel, where the mind is beginning to inform, like even like a child recognizes its mother. It sees the mother, and the recognition awakens and stimulates even more that natural love. And as we grow, the mind becomes more powerful. And number one, it matures also the natural emotions, but it also introduces what I said at the outset, another level of love, of loving things that are not necessarily that are natural to you. Now,
if somebody adopts a baby at 1 day old,
I'd rather, if you don't mind, let me just finish this whole thing and then save your question, because I don't want to digress from this point. I want to be very focused here. So let me continue here. Now, as we get older, and as I said, we have these two types of love. Now, why do you need the love that comes al pi seichel? Why can't you just say the natural love develops, like we're learning now, to the point that your maimik, machshavte, meiche, and das, hamokas adas, is something that's negei benefesh, that literally your life is dependent on it. So in other words, it's like total immersion is something that's natural and relevant to you. The answer to that, which is not is explicit, I believe, on chapter 44 in Tanya. I just want to see it inside, where he says the following. It's an important point to what we're going to get to in a moment. Yeah, at the end of chapter 44 in Tanya, he says, because when you contemplate on something that's not natural to you, it becomes far more, two things he says, far more your effort. Because if it's natural, at the end of the day, as much as seichel that you're using to understand or to relate to that natural love, it's still something that didn't come completely through your yigia and effort. And we know anything that comes through avodah is always going to be far more internal. Now, I know it sounds a little counterintuitive, because if it's natural, it seems more internal than if it's through avodah. But avodah makes it yours. Like we say, Adam reitze b'kav shalei. A person desires more one measure of their own than 9 that they receive. So essentially, the love to a father or the love to God that the neshama has naturally, even though, yes, there'll be a levels that we're talking here, moichen de gadlus and das, where you not just take it for granted and it just comes reflexively, but it comes through a lot of contemplation. But there's something about contemplation and understanding godliness that's not necessarily that God that is relating to you and your natural connection to him. In other words, the contemplation of Mamala Kalalman, Sevav Kalalman, that God fills existence, that God transcends existence, that God is beyond it all and everything is nullified before him, has an advantage because that is something that completely comes through your Avodah. It's not a natural thing. The second thing it does is that it creates a relationship with God that's beyond just your natural connection. So it's your Avodah and relates. What he says in chapter 44, he also says there that it also strengthens the intensification of love. So this, I want to focus on this because I think this is vital in understanding the whole piece here. Love has two elements to it. One is the idea that one thing is attracted to another thing. So first of all, implicit in that is that they're two separate entities. So even though a person can love themselves, but it's different than when you love something that's outside of yourself, because love creates, as we discussed, and I'll soon elaborate more, a certain, you're drawn and attracted to. You're not attracted to yourself. There's a certain natural love of oneself, but it's not like you're attracted to it and you're pursuing it. Yes, you'll take care of your needs, but the love itself is not in a state of what am I going to do to quench my love or to satisfy what I'm loving, because you're part of yourself. You don't need to have that type of relationship. So on one hand, love, there's a natural love which is something that's inherent, but there's another element of it where it causes a form of seeking, yearning, longing. And we don't say that about when you're to your own natural self. Even with a parent, even though you can say when your parent is distant from you, you long to see them, but at the end of the day, once you do see them, the longing is not quite the same way. Because now they're always part of who you are. You're longing to connect, but not because you're longing to love them, because you already love them. Since you love the person, you want to see them. Whereas when you have a love that comes from something that is not natural, there the longing is far deeper because there's no natural connection. It's all based on the longing. And therefore, that love is very much more connected with things like thirst, longing, yearning, and so on. So now I'm going to introduce a few more names for love and put it then into context. So in Tanya, he introduces a few more levels of love. Comes from Zohar. There's a level called Avas Olam, Ava Rabba, and Ava B'Tainugim. Keep that in mind, 3 levels. Then there's another 2, one called Ava like fire and Ava like water. And I'm going to now apply that to everything we've been discussing right now. Let's start with the Ava, the first 3. What does he say in Tanya? He says in chapter 43 that Avas Olam is the love that comes through his bonus, not natural love. You contemplate on something and it creates a love. That's what Avas Olam. Ava Rabba is a gift that's given to you from above. And then the natural love that we have for life or for a father has in it actually both elements. On one hand, it's a love that's given to us. It's not something we earned, but we could also put avodah into it and contemplate on it. And when we do, the love becomes more revealed. So we have that. Ava b'tainugim in this context is the highest level. Ava b'tainugim is a level like that is compared to Ava of water. It's very peaceful and calm. It's like when it's an Ava that doesn't make a noise, because it's like being like a fish in water. You're at home. I mentioned before, you love your parent, and when the parent is distant, there's a certain longing. But once you're close together, there's love. But the love is a very calm love because it's natural, it's biological. Like I gave the example of sibling love. It doesn't make a lot of noise. The only time it would have an element of longing would be because you're physically not in the same proximity, just like a person, as father or mother passed away, and they long to see them. But the not love itself is, when it's there, is a very calm type of love. The love of passion, of fire, in some extent, there's there when there's a distance, but where is it really alive most? The love, romantic love, is a love of fire, because there's nothing taken for granted, because there's no biological connection, even though it's true that soulmates are soulmates, but that's on a soul level. And that's why in marriage, the love is a very different type of love than the natural love that you have biologically. Now, it's true, a couple can grow together and become as close and even closer than a child and a parent, but it's still something that came initially as two different entities. And these two entities became like one. So there's an element of, much more element of the fiery dimension of it. So now, in chapter 9 in Tanya, he makes it very clear that when the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Abamis are at war, what are you going to love? Are you going to love materialism and all the desires of the animal soul? Or are you going to love God and God's interests? In other words, a transcendent love, spiritual objectives. And there's a battle, because we're not two entities. One body, irktana ze'aguf, the human being is like a small city. And the city, there's a battle going on between two wars, two kings, two nations. Like he says, Luma Lum Yametz, Esav and Yaakov are at war with each other. When Rivka had a painful pregnancy, that's what Hashem told her. You have two nations inside you. What are these two nations? The Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis. They both want to dominate the city, which is you, the person. So now he says, when the Nefesh Elikis prevails and is winning the battle, what does it do? It doesn't just subdue the animal soul. Its love for God is so intense that it also consumes the animal soul, that the animal soul should also be part of it. So he first talks about the great fiery flame, because there's a battle going on. And there's a fiery flame. I'm using the actual words from Tanya. He says that through Nefesh Elikis, through its chabad, its contemplation on the greatness of God, because remember, we're not just talking about the Nefesh Elikis connecting to God, that it should be at peace with God. That's the natural love it has. We're talking about the Nefesh Elikis that now has to convince and prevail over an alien, a foreign entity that has no interest in godliness. Nefesh Abamis is focused on its own selfish needs, its impulsive, emotional, subjective needs. So he says, so when you contemplate that, that gives birth through das. He uses das as well, like based on the same idea in chapter 3 in Tanya, but now he's applying it. So it awakens an awe of God in the mind, a fear, a type of trembling and trepidation in the heart. And that Avos Hashem ke'esh, like a fire, burns in his heart like a flaming fire, to the point, all these expressions, nichstefa v'gam kolsa nafshe, it longs to the point that it expires even and becomes dissolved, v'chasheke v'chafetze, all these languages, to the point that it becomes, he uses exactly these words, that the whole heart, both sides of the heart, remember, the right side of the heart is where the divine soul resides. The left side of the heart is where the animal soul resides. So it now completely fills the whole heart. Also, the left side of the heart, it should be completely filled. And he says, Moli v'godush, not just filled, but also overflowing, to the point that it also spreads into the left side of the heart, and it subdues the desires and passions of the animal soul. But more than that, it actually transforms them from the pleasures of this world, that it should start loving God. And what does he say? B'chol levavcha, b'shnei yitzarecha. Both yitzers, yetzer tov and yetzer hara. Then the Alter Rebbe continues, chapter 9. He says, "V'hainu sheyala v'yovi agilam adregas avarabba." And now the next step is this love moves from fiery love to a watery love. He says it then goes up to a level of Ava Rabba, the Chibi Yisera, Memadregas Ava Aza Kirish Be'esh. A higher level, which he says is called Ava B'Tainugim. Because when the battle is going on, obviously the more passion you have, the better it's going to be for being able to subdue, and transform the enemy, so to speak. But once you come to a level where you have done that, you don't want to be fighting and constantly having that fire have to be fire. So there comes, we'll call it a more peaceful, a more serene type of love, like water. And why is that so vital? Because you have to remember, water is also the source of all the pleasures of this world. So you need the water of the Nefesh Elikis to also impact the water of the Nefesh Habamis. And he calls that Oinig. Here, it's like the difference between the 6 days of the week where we battle with Yemei HaChayil, weekdays. So it's a far more fiery type of experience, like we spoke yesterday about the Karbonos on the Mizbeach and the outer Mizbeach, because you're dealing with an animal soul. An animal has resistance. You have to burn it down, so to speak, to offer it. Whereas Keteris, the Mizbeach Keteris, is a peaceful form of service. In other words, one is about a fight between good and the opposite. The other is, once the good prevails, is an element of like Shabbos compared to the 6 days of the week. It's not a day of battle. It's not a day of birurim in the regular conventional sense. Birurim is when there's a battle between the spark is concealed within whatever item in the world it is, and you need to extract it. Shabbos is a peaceful experience, as we also learned in volume 2. Yom Kippur, of course, is a Shabbos of all Shabbos. It's even more so. So that's called, relatively speaking, to the Avas Elam and the Ava Rabbah that we talked about. Now we're getting to Ava B'Tainugim, and that is an Ava, a serene type of Ava that comes from Chachme, he says, Moyecha Chachme, where a person is now, the mind is enjoying, is Misanig Ba'askolos Hashem B'diyoseh, as much as like water, and that transforms the pleasures that come from the water of the animal soul. That's what he says in chapter 9. Okay. In chapter 50 now, the Alter Rebbe goes back.
From the nefesh kiss, not the animal soul.
What?
שבקדושת נפש האלוקיס. בחירת המים יותר האור זרוע שבקדושת נפש האלוקיס.
Yeah, and that transforms, if you look further in the line, like I just said.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, in chapter 50, which is actually, that's what we're quoting here, and that's why I'm elaborating to explain chapter 50 now. Here, it seems, is a contradiction. And the Rebbe actually notes it when in his commentary on Tanya. Now that what does he say in chapter 50? In chapter 50, and I'm looking now at Perek Nun in Tanya, says the following, that all the levels of Ava Hanal, he says, Kol B'chinas Madrigas Ava Hanal, all the levels. We're talking now Ava Elo, Ava Salem, Ava Rabbah, even Ava B'Tainugim, even though he didn't discuss it earlier, but discussed it a lot earlier. He said all that is from the level of Chesed, Mesitra Diyamina, the level of the Kohen, called Kesef, like Kesef and Zav, silver and gold. So it's silver, which comes from Chesed, from the word Nichsif, Nichsafta, the word we've been using, Chesed, that it yearns, it longs. That's what that type of love. Then he says, Ach yesh oid b'chinas ava ha'oila al kulana. But then there's another level of love that's oila al kulana. That's the words of the Alter Rebbe. It goes above them all, which would apparently also include Ava B'Tainugim, higher than Ava B'Tainugim. And what is this one? This is called gold. Kamailas Hazov ala Kesef. We know gold is more valuable than silver. What is that in Aveda? The Ava Kirish Be'esh, Mibchinas Gvuras Al Yenis. This is an Ava that's burning like a fire that comes from the Gvuras Al Yenis, from Bina. Not from, Bina is the side of Gvura. Chachma is the side of Chesed. Chachma is on the right. Chachma Chesed Netzach. So he says this comes from Bina Ilah, the Hizbananus, the Gedulas Ein Sof, the Kula Kamei Kala Chashiv, Kala Mamish Chashiv. That causes a burning fire in the heart, appreciating God's beauty and God's grandeur and majesty. Shalhevis Aza, a very intense flame. that causes like a flame to the extent it actually causes, when a fire is really burning intensely, what happens? The fire is jumping away from its very source, meaning the wood, like he says, me'etzim, and the psila and the wick. So when the fire is burning calmly, it's also gravitating upward. But when a fire is very intense, you see it literally like jumping. It jumps and flickers in a very strong way. And he says, like, what is that in the nimshal? You come to such a thirst, and here are the three stages that he spoke about that he quoted in Ayin Beis. This causes you, number one, to a deep thirst, and then to the point where you have love sickness. It's not just that you're thirsty. The thirst is actually making you sick. Sick, we mean here literally that you can't function. And the third level, it brings you to kleis hanefesh. Bali de kleis hanefesh mamish. Gam kol nafshi. Nichsafol gam kol nafshi. Now he's talking about the higher. So kol nafshi, that you're entirely expiring and being dissolved, absorbed into the source. This is what the Rebbe Rashab quoted. This Tanya, these words. Now, and he says this is the level of Levim, not the level of Kohen. Kohen is Chesed, Levi is Gvura, and then he talks about how Levi will ultimately be the Kohanim L'Asad Lave. It's all relevant how they actually exchange roles later. Okay. And then he says, hold on. What's up? Let me finish. There are people. I really need to do this whole picture here. I have a whole story to tell here. So let me finish the story, and I'll take as many questions and comments as you like. 1 second. So now he says like this. Now he continues. So first I still have to answer the question. So what does it say? We're now saying that a love of fire is higher than the love of water. Water is like chesed. Ava b'tainugim seem to be higher in chapter, for sure higher in chapter 9. Here suddenly he's saying this is higher. But 1 second. The next one more point needs to be made, which is critical to understand this parentheses. So then he says, interesting, the Alter Rebbe says something here really unique. I'm just pointing it out for interest. He says, it's impossible to explain this in writing, properly in writing. He says every person has to experience it on their own, each person according to that way. So I think it's the only time the Alter Rebbe says this in Tanya. Remember, Tanya was meant to capture, like a Yechidus, a personal audience. And the Alter Rebbe put into writing everything he would have said. But here he says, suddenly he comes to this point, he says, this is impossible to communicate effectively in writing. He says it in chapter 50 in Tanya. And each person has to focus and contemplate on it. And the whole expression, every person in his own way, and in the brackets, he actually adds, yesh mispal, yesh mispal. There's a person that gets excited one way, another gets stimulated another way. I don't want to go into that right now. I just wanted to point out the Alter Rebbe says that, so you can imagine how we don't have that words are pretty much inadequate to really convey the whole experience. But so be it. But then he concludes, and this is vital to our discussion. This is going to be the one final point that really will bring it all together. He says, "Now v'hine seder ha'avoda be'esek ha'terev ha'mitzvos ha'nimshachas mebchinas ava azazu." Because right now, if we stop right here, so what are we left with? We're left with a person that's reached many levels of love. They've come now to this Eila al Kulana, this highest level, burning like a fiery, like a passionate fire, which is literally unable to be contained by the wood and by its very wick. It's being consumed, 3 levels: thirst, love sickness, and being totally consumed, kles hanefesh. So what are we left with here? We're left with a neshama that is now completely consumed with godliness. But that's not the kavanah. That's beautiful from the point of view of avodah, that you were once a neshama down here below, was so-called not connected or not aware, and it's grown through all the levels we talked about. The natural love, the love that comes up is seichel, the seichel that comes with the natural love, all the way to these highest levels that we're describing. But that's not the kavanah. So the Alter Rebbe says that the Seder Haveda, however, the orderly way, the Haveda of Torah mitzvahs, that Hanim Sheches, because this Azazu is not meant to be an end in itself. So this if it's really a passionate love to God and not about you, you have to do what God wants, not what you want. And here's the Alter Rebbe is touching upon something that is so vital in all relationships. You can be so consumed with love for someone and you forget that it's not about you. It's about the other person, what they want. If you really love them, you can't just do it on your terms. So here he's going to express the ultimate bittul that is required, that it shouldn't remain a selfish love. Now, I know selfish here is not an appropriate word because it's selfish for godliness, but it's still self-oriented. It's just kedusha. It's a selfish kedusha. It's holy. Obviously, it's not selfish for negative or destructive purposes or hurting anyone, God forbid. So he says, so what is the Seder Aveda that is nimsheches, that extends from this passionate love that's burning and completely rotze, he b'chinas shuv, that it has to result in a shuv, in a return, levad. Like he says in Sefer Yetzirah, he brings, Imirotz lipcha, if your heart is running, is yearning, is longing, shuv le'echad. You have to return to echad. Pirush, Alter Rebbe explains, Imirotz lipcha hitchukas hanefesh habalav b'chol hayimoni. Rotz lipcha is referring to the right side of the heart of the animal, the divine soul, that it's running. Kim shemiz gaberes u'mislaheves u'mislahetes b'me'ed ma'ed. He's literally saying, it intensifies, it's passion, it's burning. Mislahetes is even more fiery burning. B'ma'od ma'od. Can you imagine these expressions? Miskaberes, mislaheves, mislahetes, b'ma'od ma'od. So it's like as passionate as it could be. Ad kaleis hanefesh mamish, lishtapich el chek aviha chaya chayim baruch hu. It literally is completely losing its own life in order. Oh wow, this is strong words. It completely is like being absorbed. Chek avia is the lap of its father. Chaya chaim, the life of all life.
Overpouring herself. Leishtapech, overpouring.
Yeah, it's like shvichas hanefesh, outpour. Yeah, completely. Ulatseis memaisra begufa gufni v'gashmi. To leave the prison. The prison. Remember, he's calling it a prison of the body, of the physical body. The dovka boyes baruch, to attach itself to God. 4 lines, the Alter Rebbe just explained this passion. So what do you have to do? Says the Sefer Yetzirah, when Ratz Lipcha, when your heart is such a expiring state, Ozai. And this is the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab quotes, Ozai zeis yoshiv el liboy. This is what you have to, yoshiv el liboy, essentially, yoshiv el liboy, either respond in your heart or yoshiv, return in your heart. What? The Maimar Razal, al korchach ki al korchach atachai, that God compels you to live. The guf hazeh lachyese, the purpose is not to remain, not to just long and become encompassed in godliness, but to come and live in this physical world and to draw down the divine life, lamata, through Teres Chaim, liyas dira b'tachtenim, to make a dira b'tachtenim, la'achdusei yizbarach. That's the shuv le'echad. To make a dira, a home for God, where? Not in these high passionate levels, down in this world, in a revealed way. That's what the Alter Rebbe says here in chapter 50. So what do we have from this? And this is what we'll bring it back now to the Ayin Beis. That love itself, on one hand, is a tremendous virtue. And it brings you a person who, instead of loving this physical material world is loving God. It's not just as it's a mitzvah, it's like you can consider it to be one of the highest levels of reaching. And yet, it also has, I don't want to call it a downside, but it has one more element that's necessary, a bittul. That even when it reaches its highest levels of passion, that it has to remember, Yoshev El Libe, that the ultimate purpose is not the source, but to bring the source down below. This doesn't mean not to be passionate. It means bring that passion, not just to yourself, but to the world. Like the difference in a tzaddik in pelts. A tzaddik, when it's cold, puts on a fur coat and he warms himself, but no one else is warm. And the tzaddik instead, who lights a beautiful fire that everybody can be warmed by. In other words, take that full passion, and as much as you want to remain encompassed and dissolved and absorbed within the source, bring that back all to this earth. And that is the ultimate purpose. Now, so let me now go back to the question of, so which one is it? Is Ava b'tainugim or Ava like a fire? Which one is greater? So the general answer given, the Rebbe gives an answer that there's two levels in Ava b'tainugim. There's an Ava b'tainugim that's lower than the fire. That is what he talks about here in chapter 50. And there's Ava b'tainugim that's higher than the fire. That he talks about in Tanya in chapter 9. And he brings a Tzemach Tzedek that explains that, which is not...
The Rabbi is saying it.
Yeah, he brings it Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe on chapter 50 in Tanya, he brings this Tzemach Tzedek. 1 second. Now, this is not an uncommon answer. There are levels. There's always levels. In other words, it's all relative. So there's an Ava b'tainugim that's a very high level. There's Ava b'tainugim that is a lower level. And Ava Krish Be'esh here clearly creates a whole new level of passion, of Kleis HaNefesh. Ava b'tainugim, as we said, is not Kleis HaNefesh. Ava b'tainugim is not passionate. Ava b'tainugim is very calm and serene. It's what you're experiencing when you're in the source. Here, you're talking about something that requires a passion because you want to escape this world and the prison and the limitations, and you want to be consumed by the higher reality. But based on the Ayin Beis, I'm going to go back now to Ayin Beis, and you'll see how the whole Ayin Beis is actually coming to explain all this in Tanya, and it's even richer once you know the Rebbe's answer. The Ayin Beis actually refers to this as well. What does he say? I'm going to read now the Ayin Beis. Now that we've covered this, I'm going to learn the Ayin Beis, and then I promise you I shall stop, and you can ask any question you like. But I just want to finish the whole subject, and it's recorded, so anyone wants to review it, they can review it. So now he says like this. Now we have to introduce back to what he says in Ayin Beis. In Ava itself, as we've discussed at length, there are many levels. Like let's talk about the love of your father. You deeply love your father. But as you get older, you love him more and more. You learn more about him. The more you learn about him, the more there's a deeper love. Now, in Ava itself, we spoke, there's an Ava al pitam v'das. That's what's logical. There's also an Ava that you can have that's natural, but you also immerse yourself in trying to understand that which you love, you want to understand. And that has the values that we spoke about. It's not just the natural, it's also bringing your whole being into it. You immerse yourself. Like he said, negei b'nefesh, it's mamish negei tluyim boy, shachayev tluyim boy, hamokas hadas. Fine. But remember, God, even a human being, but for sure God, is always beyond us. As much as you know, as much as you can love him, and as much as you're aware of him, there's always deeper levels. So that's why it's so important. We're going back to the point of the Metzach. The Metzach, remember, is super conscious and super rational. It's beyond our containers, but it's still not the ultimate, because we don't know what's going on behind the Metzach. Behind the forehead is a whole Tam V'das. I'm saying Tam V'das HaKomos and a Tam and Tainug that's completely beyond us. So the point here is that even this highest level of this highest level of love is still not the highest ultimate essence, because at the end of the day, it's an Ava that's connecting to the Metzach. Chochmah and Bina are gazing at the forehead, which, yes, draws down from Atik, but it's not Atik. And it's definitely not higher than Atik. It's the forehead. In other words, we're relating to God's desire, and our love is so deep that you want to completely be encompassed in God's will, and whatever, obviously in higher levels as well, even if we can't relate to them, which also explains why it's so fiery. Precisely that. Fire is always a result of resistance, as I explained. So as long as that love is, as long as there's still more to long for, it's going to be a very fiery, compassionate type of love. What is Ava B'Tainugim on the higher level? Not the lower Ava B'Tain, the higher level. That's Mayim. That's when you come and you actually are totally at peace. That would be deeper than Ratzon. That would be Tainug. And when you come there, you actually, that causes you to return, because when you really recognize what the Eibishter wants, it's not just your passion that's fiery, it actually causes you to return and make a dira b'tachtenim. So the Rebbe Rashab adds something that I've not seen anywhere else, and even the Rebbe's answer, it leads to this, but he's actually saying that even though the Alter Rebbe doesn't say Ava b'Tainugim, but that Shuv is Mayim. Mayim, remember, runs downward. Eish goes upward. So Eish is Rotzeh, Mayim is Shuv. So what the Alter Rebbe Rashab says, that Shuv, because the Ava Kirish Be'esh, or the Ava, what he calls the Ava that's connected to Rotzen, is corresponds to the Ava B'Tainugim that's behind the Metzach, Tainug of Atik, that's what causes the Shuv to return. So the parentheses now comes to say two things. First of all, we have in Tanya the levels of Tzemoyin, thirst of the Chetzenius of the Etzem, which is the first level of B'chol Meidecha. We then have the higher level, the Primius of the Etzem, which is not thirst, it's Kleis HaNefesh, complete absorption. But then we also have another thing, that we also, through that, come to the second part of Tanya, that comes back to the Shuv, that's connected to the Mayim of Ava B'Tainugim. That's my understanding of what the Rebbe Rashab says in this parentheses. So now,
the Rabbi is not mentioning here Ava B'Tanugim.
The Rebbe Rashab is, however.
Yeah, I understand, but in Perek Nun, it's not being mentioned.
I just said that. I just explained that. But he's saying it in Ayin Beis, he does mention it. So I'm explaining how he's using it. And he's saying it in the context of Perek Nun. Let's read it inside now. So I'm going to say the first parentheses, it's all Rotzen because it's all Metzach. Then he says, V'yesh Leimer. I'm reading the Tanya, the bottom of page 1246 to the top of 1247 now. V'yesh Leimer shezeu masha kosev b'sefer shel beinim Perek Nun. This is what it says in Tanya Chapter 50. Umizeh bali deit semoin. What's a mizeh? That great hisbonenus, the contemplation on the greatness of the divine. That brings to a fiery love, that brings to thirst. And then to love sickness. And then afterwards he comes to the level of complete expiration, complete dissolving and absorption in the source, mamish. So the Rebbe Rashab says, the lefiha muvan sham b'chinas kleis hanefesh b'chinas ava gam b'chinas kleis hanefesh. Even this highest level is also b'chinas ava b'dish be'esh. That all the levels are all the fiery love. B'hainu she'ein zeh b'chinas ava b'tainugim she b'chinas mayim k'may shekasem b'perek tes. This is not the ava b'tainugim of water, like he says in chapter 9. In chapter 9, ava b'tainugim is water. This level of Kleis HaNefesh is fire, as I explained. V'cheinu ba'kitzur, and yes, indeed, like I said yesterday, this is the kitzur of the Tzemach Tzedek on chapter 50. He says clearly the three levels, Semoyin, thirst, love sickness, and absorption are all part of the fire. Then the Rebbe Rashab says this kiddush. So first of all, you see immediately he's referring to chapter 9, not just to say Ava Tainugim is like water, but these levels. But then he says, here you see the reconciliation between the two. The Ava Zu b'chinas harotzen. This Ava, which is the level of Rotzen, which is Kleis HaNefesh, the Metzach. One second, let me finish. I'm middle of reading. What's going on here?
No, you skipped 3 words.
I didn't skip anything. I didn't skip anything.
What is this?
I just explained it. That the Tzemach Tzedek's kitzur on chapter 50 in Tanya.
Okay, thank you.
V'yesh leimer, the avazu b'chinas harotzen. This love, this passionate, fiery love, in the level of rotzen, of metzach, forehead, he b'madrega achas in b'chinas ava b'tainugim she b'chinas hatainug. it's on one level with Ava b'Tainugim. Now, what does that mean? Tainug and Rotza are not the same. But remember, the Metzach draws the Shin Ayin, the 370 energies and lights from Atik. So the Metzach is the level of Tainug, except we don't see the Tainug. The Tainug is so-called behind the forehead, behind the scenes. But it's on the same level. This is a Chiddush, but this Chiddush comes to understand the whole continuing section of Tanya. Listen to this now. Because here comes a question. If the Av is so passionate and so fiery, and it wants to be encompassed in its source, where is it getting the message that it should be Shuv le'echad, that it should come in a state of Shuv? So the simple answer is, because the bittul that it has, that's what the Sefer Yetzirah is saying. That's why you need V'shuv le'echad, Yoshev el libay, that you should return, Yoshev el libay, in other words, you should respond. That return with your Yoshev el libay means a bunch of different things. But basically, like I said, it's the response is that you need to take to heart and bring it down. But the Rebbe Rashab is making it a lot richer. There's a reason why. Because the Ava Kirotz Ke'irish Be'esh, as passionate and fiery as it is, that's touching the Metzach and the Rotzen, is getting a message from the Tainug as follows. Like he continues in chapter 50, like I read. Yeah, period. One second, before I finish the last lines. So he's saying, because it's connected to Ava b'Tainugim, and the Tainug of the Eibishter is not that you should be encompassed through fire in him, but that you should return, which is what water is. Return and bring the kavanah of make adir b'tachtenim, taking the passion and turning it downward instead of going upward. So that's why it leads to a shuv. That's the ulachain. What's the lachain? The reason is because the Ava of the B'chinas Ratzin is the same level as Ava b'Tainugim. So clearly he's associating the two. That's my understanding of this. There may be other ways to learn this, but I think this is the way to me, it's very clear that's what he means. Then the final two lines in this parentheses, he brings now in chapter 10 in Tanya, where he talks about the tzaddik gomer and tzaddik she'ena gomer. So he talks about the tzaddik gomer, the higher level of a tzaddik. He calls them bnei aliyah. And he has two reasons why are they called bnei aliyah. But Rashbi said, "Re'isi bnei aliyah v'hei mu'atim." So in chapter 10, he gives two reasons for it. He says, "So the first reason is because they transform Ra to Gedusha. They're Mailim, Mahapchina Ra or Mailim. So Bnei Aliyah, they elevate the negative into the positive. And then the second reason he says, V'oid Nikrayim Bnei Aliyah in chapter 10. Because also they're avoided when they're not just when they're transforming the negative, but also when they're doing good, they're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it Seder Geveya. They're doing it for Aliyah, not for themselves, but for God. They're not doing it because they want to be attached to God alone. Obviously, that's part of it. But they're not just doing to quench their thirst, that is thirsting toward God. Ella, like he says in Tikkunim, that their kavana is bnei aliyah, is not for themselves, that God says that they should bring it down. He brings here like a child that's moisa nefesh, gives his life for his parents, to do what? To bring down elikus b'tachtenim. Liyachta kutshebricha v'shchinta b'tachtenim. So the Rebbe Rashab is connecting the Tanyas even more so now. That by the tzaddik, who does have that ava, the level of ava ke'esh, which is the tzemayim, the thirst, also comes to a level where bnei aliyah, that they're bringing it downward to tachtenim. So therefore it's connected to what we're saying here, but there's this distinction. In Perek Yud, sheshamhu rak sheshamu b'derech memela. There it's b'derech memela. The tzaddik is so consumed with halakus in that way, he doesn't have to make an effort to do so. He just does it. But in chapter 50, There's a command that this is what you need to do. In other words, the tzaddik just naturally does it. That's what it seems like he's saying. Where here in p.1246, he's not talking about the tzaddik. He's talking about the Beinoni. That the Beinoni, as much as passionate as he gets, he needs to then dictate and impose upon himself, Yoshev el libei, that's the language in chapter 50, to the shuv le'echad, to bring it down to tachtenim and not just remain in that passionate place. Okay, which of course also explains the story with Nadav and Avihu. There they were consumed with the fire, and they did not have the Ava b'tainugim, and did not have this level that brings it back down. The same thing with the three others that went into the Pardes, except Rabbi Akiva, besides Rabbi Akiva, who also were consumed with the passion and did not have this Yoshev el libei that was necessary. And explains many, many other things. Anyway, I know I dedicated the whole class to this explanation, but I thought it's vital, understanding it all, and you really get to appreciate what the Rebbe Rashab is doing here. It's not just equating a Tanya to what we learn here. It's really a whole explanation of the whole process of the different levels of love, back and forth. So now at this point, we come to, not only have we reached the highest levels of passionate love, fiery love, we've also reached the level of a love that in turn informs and brings the serenity and the calm of water that brings that fiery passion back to earth, so to speak, back downward. So the love is not just going up, it's also coming down, and you have the full picture of mutva, murgish, and muskul, the development of emotions, intellect forming emotions, how they work together, and how they even ultimately even return to do the job on this earth as much as they are consumed with the passion of godliness. Okay. The floor is yours. Any questions you have, please.
It's a little hard to understand that the avozu is b'madrega achas im avo b'tanugim, because here it's rotzoi, kirish fayesh and longing, and maybe b'madrega achas, but it's not the avo b'tanugim.
Well, I just explained it based on what we learned earlier, that the metzach, the staklus of Chochmah Bina to the forehead of Arich draws from the Shin Ayin Neherin of Atik. That's how he explains it, because it does draw it down. If you go back to where did he begin? He began the topic began at the bottom, on top of page 1237. Yeah, that's how Ravid Deraivin. That's what Ravid Deraivin does. It elevates. The bottom of page 1240 is where he explains that. If you want to understand it, read that. Okay.
Okay, it's also from this, everything in Perek Nun, it's talking about Avo B'Tanugim.
I didn't say that at all. I didn't say that.
No, I'm asking.
I explained it. I thought I explained it. I thought I explained it quite extensively here.
But according to the Rebbe Rashab, that it brings to show, that means that all of these things, the Milas is over the Kesef, it's talking here about Madrego Achas, Imavu B'Tanugim. It's not talking about another thing. I'm right or wrong? I'm asking.
I don't know. You're wrong. He begins by saying, firstly, that all the Avos we spoke about.
Yeah, this I understand.
But one second, let me say, are Chesed, Koyim, Kesef. Then he says, Eil al Kulana is the Ava of Eish, Gevura, Bina, which of course is very relevant to our discussion, because Chacham and Bina is Mayim and Eish, is the Chesed and Gevura, which we're going to learn about more. Then he says that itself has three levels: thirst, Chelas Ava, and Klesa Nefesh. And then he says, then the kavanah of that is that it should bring back to Shuv. So based on the Rebbe Rashab's explanation, that Shuv sounds like an Ava B'Tainugim that follows the Ava Keish. That's my take on this.
No,
but the chapter speaks about all of it.
Three levels, all the three levels, or only an Nichsef V'Gam Kol Tzon Nafshi Klesa Nefesh? I think all the three levels, no?
Why not? I mean, he says here that all of them, all three are part of Eish, but also Klesa Nefesh. The real challenge is Klesa Nefesh. The other two are not yet completely consumed by their source. Moyin Achelis Ava are going upward, but Klesa Nefesh is the ultimate consumption. So that's where its biggest effect is on Klesa Nefesh. But yes, in general, it's basically fire needs to be quenched, not just by, but it needs to be somewhat calmed down by water. So the avikamayim, so to speak, brings that the eish back downward, so to speak, like that.
A Bainani does it in real time. He goes up, he goes down, but a tzaddik just is everything. All the levels are at once. Is that the type of thing that he's saying?
I don't know about all the levels. All he says here is that this level, that they are bnei aliyah, that their focus is what Hashem wants to come down, doesn't need to be. They don't need to be told Yoshev el Libe. They naturally do that. They automatically do that. That's what he says. That
So
they naturally.
so it's actually not in time.
Bainani.
A tzaddik is automatically at the right place but there's not a sense of one thing follows another thing. He's already doing it.
I don't know. Yeah, I wouldn't say that at all.
No?
Tzaddik, no, I don't agree. No, a tzaddik also goes through all the levels. That's fine. A tzaddik is not. A tzaddik, of course, a tzaddik goes through everyone. There's no. The tzaddik for sure is going through levels. That's not what he's saying. He's not going through levels. He's saying one thing only. This element of that, the being encompassed and returning to be able to fulfill the dir b'tachtenim in Perik Yud, he's talking about that it's coming b'derech mamela, and in Perik Nun he's talking that it comes through a command, an effort, a work, a avodah. That's all he's saying here.
Which you said is a Bainani at that point. I thought.
Not at that point. It's most likely the difference between chapter 10 and chapter 50 is chapter 10 is talking about a tzaddik, and chapter 50 is talking about a Bainani. That's how else can you explain it?
Okay, so that clarifies it. And I just want the thing I was asking about was the natural love. I mean, could that be the same type of natural? The baby's adopted at 1 day old, and he's sort of imprinted. Is that the same thing, or is it something that actually has to be born with, so to speak?
That's something we can debate and argue. I don't know. I mean, I would assume real natural love is the closest is real biological, and but doesn't mean a person cannot develop a very deep love to an adopted child. So but it's definitely not what he's speaking about. Ayin Beis does not address this issue. You understand? You're asking a question. It's something that we can discuss. I would say it's probably 2 levels, because remember, there's many, many levels. You could have love to something. Nature, sometimes nurture can be almost like nature. People can develop something that becomes literally like a second nature to them. So obviously, but here he's talking about obviously the most natural.
Rabbi, can I ask a question just to see if I understood what you said? So when we talked previously about Chachma and Bina working together, along with Mochin working with Midos to elevate the Nefesh to the highest level of, I guess, closeness with the Eibishter, Elokus, and we said that's gazing at the Metzach, and that generates this, I guess, Rishvei Esh. But what's really behind the Metzach is the Ratzon, is Tainug, is something that is actually calmer. It's even higher. It's an Atik, I guess, but it's saying, yes, you're all fired up, but if you really want to know my will, you have to take that passion and bring it down into the lower worlds and make it a dwelling place for me. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. It's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
No. You said it in Perek Nun, it's talking about a Bainani.
How else are you going to explain the difference? Chapter 10 is the only Perek Yud is the only Perek really dedicated to tzaddik. The rest of Tanya is all about the Bainani. So that's Bapashtus.
But Abba B'Tanugim, this is not a target that a Bainani could reach. I think so.
That's not correct.
Not correct?
Look at chapter 9. He's talking about a Bainani in chapter 9, not about a tzaddik.
What I find interesting here is we talk about.
Hold on. Let me just comment. There's many levels in Ava B'Tainugim, but Tanya is generally Sefer Shel Bainanim. Perek Yud is about, obviously a tzaddik's Ava B'Tainugim is higher, but Perek Tes, he doesn't yet designate the word Bainani, but he says there's a battle, and when the Nefesh Shalikis prevails, it comes to the level of Ava B'Tainugim. The tzaddik, Ava B'Tainugim, is so extensive that he transforms the Nefesh Abamis to, it completely transforms it. And and therefore Bnei Aliyah comes automatically. But by a Beinoni, it's always a Milchama. He's always having this war. So whether he reaches Ava B'Tainugim all the time, maybe not. But there may be moments. Perek Nun, why would you say Perek Nun is talking about a tzaddik? Where does he say that? I mean, to me, it's a given that he's most likely talking about something that people can reach, everyone according to their madreg. He says, L'fum shur delay. He even said, Kol chad v'chad l'fum shur delay. So it's all relative, that's all.
Okay, so this, at least by me, it's a revolution that all of these high dargets is discussing in Perek Nun, the Rebbe Rashab is claiming Madriga Achaz, this is Shaykh is also by Beinoni.
I always understood that all of Tanya Shaykh to Beinoni. Even Perek Yud, which is the tzaddik, the Dakus Beinoni could have certain levels like that. But you understood that part of Tanya is not for Beinoni? Which part of Tanya? Isn't it called Sefer Shel Beinoni?
Okay, that makes sense what you're saying.
Okay, so there's levels and levels. Listen, Alter Rebbe laid out, by us, we have challenge even controlling our Yetzer Hara for 1 minute, let alone our entire lifetime. Okay, go ahead. You wanted to say something else, Yitzchak?
Yeah, I wanted to say that this, in a bigger picture, and forgive me for generalizing. I know you don't like us when we process or overgeneralize, but I guess I'm trying to make a connection, see if it makes sense to you. If we think about the essence of the Eibishter, it's Ava. I mean, he was Mitzamtzem himself to create this world. So he's selfless, right? He wants us to be selfless.
That's a chapter in Tanya, by the way, in chapter 49. That's what he talks about. Yeah.
So once you get to this highest level of closeness, you really get close to the Eibishter. He says, great, you made it, but you really want to know my will. My will is Ava. It's selfless. It means don't do this for yourself. Don't come to me. Do what I do. Get out of yourself. Go back to love the other. Go back to the world and bring my will of love into the world. Make it a dira for me. So does that make sense in some general way?
Yeah, of course. This is a process called Rotzei V'Shuv, where we're constantly in this type of state. That, when Noach initially, when the flood happened, Noach didn't want to go into the ark. Once he went into the ark, he didn't want to leave the ark because it was very comfortable. The Meraglim, they were in the wilderness. They didn't want to leave the wilderness because it was very spiritual. Why would they go into a world into a land that consumes its inhabitants? The neshama doesn't want to come to this world. Al korchach atachai, it has to be compelled. But once it's here, doesn't want to leave. There's always this tug, which is the essence of life, the pulse, that it's contracting and expanding, the breath, inhaling and exhaling. We're always in a process. In a healthy human being, a heart looks like this, right? It's a wave. It's not a flat line, God forbid. It's always attention and resolution. There's always two poles. One is you're seeking something, you're yearning it, you internalize it, and then you yearn again. When it's too extreme, that's when problems begin. Actually, in many ways, many of mental illnesses and emotional imbalances and chemical imbalances are based on that. It's extreme highs and extreme lows. Very high levels of, let's say, mania, what they call bipolar, and low levels of depression. And that's imbalance. So with too much anxiety or too much resolution, you need to have a constant balance. It's like a flame. The soul is compared to a flame of God. Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. It has to yearn, but not to the point where it completely can the challenge of people who burned out. Like I said, Nadav and Avihu. And lahavdil, even the people you hear about, these geniuses, whether Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin or Jim Morrison, etc., and so many who are such genius people, they had a lot of high-level yearnings, but they couldn't contain it. They couldn't bring it down. And then they're the opposite, people who suffer from too much animal bliss, and they don't have enough yearnings and aspirations for transcendence. So this is essential to everything.
100%. Thank you. It was a wonderful reconciliation of Sefer Shel Beinanim with this last portion of Ayin Beis. Very helpful.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm glad it's recorded because I can assure you, you probably want to listen to this more than once.
Yeah.
It's a lot here. I obviously looked into all the different svarim to really get the picture. Any other questions or comments or not? We'll sign off here.
Yeah, I'd like. Well, you know what? I'll sign off, then I'll make a comment if I could.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I just did a review, a pretty, I would say, elaborate review of the last 20 pages on one hand, but especially the last section here on the bottom of 1246 and top of 1247. So we're still at the end of the chapter, the paragraph on